Okay, so I thought it was time for a little recap on the cabinet system of government to accompany the one we did on Prime Minister's powers. And again, it's a quick pen and paper job, perhaps revision for an end of year exam question. There's a little bit of mystique about cabinet system of government because everybody knows what a cabinet is, but when we talk about the cabinet system, if it appears on a question, people might be slightly spooked by it. But all it means is the interrelationship of these bodies. So effectively, the cabinet is the thing which makes decisions, and prime ministers are there to chair that cabinet and effectively to confirm what its final decision is. And they do that, of course, with the support of a cabinet office. That's civil servants directed by the cabinet secretary. That's the head of the civil service. These people are telling permanent members of the civil service who are in charge of departments what the policy priorities of the cabinet is and what they should be pursuing. And all this is coordinated by cabinet committees. Cabinet committees are the things which really do all of the work of government. Cabinet, usually under most prime ministers, meets once a week. Under Blair, for example, there'd only be 40-minute meetings, but the cabinet committees meet much more regularly. Cabinet committee members and cabinet committee chairs are the one. This is where their real work goes on as ministers directing policy. And what they've decided then effectively is the business of cabinet, and that's just ratified by the cabinet meeting in its weekly meetings. So you might imagine that the cabinet system of government is a counterweight to prime ministerial power. And you'd be right, of course, because cabinet members have their own department, they have their own army of civil servants, they're effectively fighting their own corner of a big chunk of the government machine, often in competition with other people, and trying to make sure that they get more money, for example, or that the department grows rather than is weakened. Cabinet members are, because of individual ministerial responsibility, the ones who are responsible to Parliament. And that means they take ownership of the policy that comes out of their department. They're likely to resist a prime minister who tries to be too dictatorial. And prime ministers, when they decide policy, do so only with the approval of cabinet. And of course, we've seen May lose the approval of cabinet. And even Thatcher lost the approval of cabinet in the 1990s and of course had to resign. On the other hand, prime ministers can be seen as stronger because of cabinet government. That's because the prime minister chooses the members of the cabinet and of course reshuffles them. That's been a 20th century phenomenon. Prime ministers can create departments or remove departments or split departments or merge departments. And of course, that's an enormous amount of leverage they have over a truculent minister who might not do what they want them to do. And most importantly, perhaps, prime ministers choose who are members of cabinet committees and who are the chairs of cabinet committees, often their allies, or if not that, then effectively chair them themselves. There are 7 important cabinet committees in Boris Johnson's government at the moment, and he chairs 5 of them when he's not incapacitated, of course. And collective ministerial responsibility ensures that there's discipline within the cabinet system, that people do what the prime minister has told the cabinet secretary that they want their priorities to be. So that might mean that prime ministerial government is more important, cabinet government might be dead, and there'd be all sorts of good reasons for thinking that. You might remember here, last time we looked at prime ministerial power, we looked at cabinet government as really an overhang from the 19th century, and it might have some features to it, but increasingly through the 20th century we went to prime ministerial government, and then under Blair and Thatcher some people argued there was presidential government. And even with coalition, we still think that cabinet government itself might be something of a bit of a relic, a dignified institution, as Walter Bagehot had it. So, why is it that cabinets become less important? One is that hiring and firing of ministers by prime ministers has become something which is much more expected since the 1900s, since the early 20th century. The prime minister controls the cabinet agenda. Prime ministers don't normally call for a vote. There were some stories about Brexit where May was opposed by 8 members of her cabinet, but to formally call a vote is to suggest that there's disagreement and a lack of unanimity, and that's why prime ministers don't normally call for a vote, but affirm what they think is the majority decision by cabinet. Most decisions are already taken before they reach the cabinet, and that means that the cabinet's really just there to ratify things. And particularly under people like Tony Blair, and to a lesser extent under the coalition, Prime Ministers make much more use of bilateral meetings with ministers. That is to say, what Blair called sofa government, getting a government minister to agree what you want them to before they get to cabinet, so there's no disagreement in cabinet. Indeed, as far as Blair was concerned, no discussion in cabinet either. And the Prime Minister's office, that institutional resource which has been built up gradually by people like Wilson and then more by Thatcher and again even more by Tony Blair, means that often the Prime Minister's office has already coordinated what they want their departments to do before they've come to Parliament. And lots of ministers in New Labour and again even under the coalition have talked about the idea that the Prime Minister's office is subverting cabinet responsibility. And most importantly, perhaps, the Prime Minister is the person who's the public face of the party. They have a mandate because people assume that when a government's been elected, it's been elected because they were led by a Prime Minister. And Cabinet Ministers don't. Cabinet Ministers are there at the gift of the Prime Minister because they hired and fired them. And that's why they have much less authority. Nevertheless, there are some reasons why Cabinet might still be seen as important. Prime Ministers can't always hire and fire who they want. Think about Theresa May having to include Boris Johnson in her government. And of course, even the most powerful Prime Ministers like Blair having to keep and include Gordon Brown. Some senior ministers can work together to oppose the Prime Minister. Thatcher saw this, and effectively it meant that they lobbied for her to resign. And when we think about ministers who feel as though they've been unfairly treated, they can ask the cabinet to be a kind of referee about a dispute they might have with another department. Government departments themselves have appointed increasingly their own special political advisors, and that means that instead of civil servants who might necessarily do what ministers want, ministers have their own special political advisors with their own agenda. And senior ministers who are popular with their party might, or the public, might still have much more influence. And this was true in May's early first administration and in Cameron's, when Ken Clarke was still kept in cabinet as the leader of the House, and despite the fact that he wasn't necessarily in agreement with the wider policy of the government. Under the coalition, and who knows when we might see a coalition again, the coalition agreement on stability and reform meant that prime ministers couldn't just choose who they wanted. Cameron had to accept 7 cabinet posts for Liberal Democrats, and that significantly limited his patronage powers. So what about Johnson's cabinet? Relative to this kind of battle or balance we've got between prime ministerial power versus cabinet power, one of the things that helped Boris Johnson, of course, was getting a big majority of 80 plus in order to secure his authority. And unlike May and unlike Cameron before him as well, and indeed even unlike Brown before him, what this meant was he could effectively throw his weight around and tell Sajid Javid, the other most important person in government, look, you can carry on being my chancellor, but only if you accept that you're going to have my team of special political advisors. Javid said no self-respecting chancellor would accept this, and that's why he resigned. And effectively this means that when Rishi Sunak now is in number 11 as the chancellor, he's really just doing what Boris Johnson, and in particular Dominic Cummings, are telling him that they want him to do. Johnson's stacked the cabinet since his February reshuffle with some Brexit loyalists, imagining perhaps in February that was the most important thing they were going to consider, how to get this done by the 31st of December. And so Priti Patel, Gavin Williamson, Dominic Raab, there are other people in there as well, make this a very Brexit-heavy cabinet under Johnson's direct control. They're Johnson loyalists. There are some people in there who are senior ministers, and even if they supported Brexit or might be in policy-wise in line with Johnson, they might be seen as rivals or people who've got some authority on the backbenches. Better to have those people inside the tent pissing out rather than outside the tent pissing in. That's a famous phrase from Lyndon Baines Johnson about how you control your cabinet. And so Michael Gove, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Grant Shapps, they're all people who could be potential rivals or potential threats if they weren't given some sort of responsibility in cabinet. And then there are some token remainers to appease the backbenchers. And that's really what they are, merely a token and not people who've got any kind of real authority there. So that is your recap for the cabinet system of government, and hopefully you'll be able to make use of that when you come to revise at the end of the year for the exams. Okay.